If we want to add more content into our Mad Libs project, let's just go over how everything fits together. And then we can go over how we would string together or add another component into what we already have. So let's look at our HTML first. And we can see we have the main container here, which contains the entire project. Let's go over to the Elements tab and so we can visualize that. So we have the container here, then we have our header, we have our intro, and we have each question. And so remember, each question sort of leads into the next question. So we have a separate div for each one of our questions, and then we have a response div at the end where we can print the response. And then at the very end, we have our script tag, which adds the JavaScript in, which is what makes all this work. We only need one of those because it's the same script that does everything in this project. And so let's take a look at those divs, and then let's talk about how we would add another one if we want to include more content into the project. So on the HTML side, we have a separate div for each sort of prompt that we give the user. And with Mad Libs, if you look at if you Google like Mad Libs projects, you can see different examples of this, and they will kind of have different types of prompts. Sometimes they're parts of speech, like a noun or a verb or an adjective. And I've seen you guys are using stuff like that in your example projects. And so you can see a bunch of different versions of this. If we look at some images of this, you can see kind of how these work, where you fill in different prompts, and then it generates a story with those prompts inside of them. Thank you. Do you have a question or something I can help with? Okay. So you can kind of choose what kind of different prompts you want the user to put in, and then you can reuse those prompts to create the story that you display to the user at the end. So we have our first prompt to ask for the user name. We have another prompt to ask for a place. This is just kind of an example. And then we give the user a choice between two things using a select prompt. So the select is not as common with Mad Libs. Usually the user can just write in whatever they want. So you don't have to use this one, but it is an option that you can use. You could just delete that one and add in another input. On the script side of things, when we create a reference or a question, we have to reference each part. So each part is going to have a div which contains the input and the button to submit the input, the input itself, and then the button to save that and go to the next one. And so each one of them needs all three of these things. It's a little repetitive, and there are better ways to do this with programming, but to keep things simple, we're just going to repeat this process. So we have the same three variables for each one of our questions. So we have another one here for the place, and another one here for the choice, and then we just have one for our response at the end. And then for each one of our buttons, we just connect a click event to a function. So when the user clicks on the button, we use the function to go to the next question. For each question, we get the value and use a conditional statement. You can see here to check that that value exists. And then we move on to the next question by hiding the previous question and showing the next question. And then at the very end, all the way down here, in our last question, we are going to put together our entire story. So that's what I'll go over now, is if that ends up changing. If we add another question, if it's at the end versus in the middle, how do we modify the code to keep everything intact, but add in our new question to this section? All right, so let's add in our question here. And I'll add it at the end after the choice div, because we're going to have to modify the ending. So let's go down here. I have all my HTML like very kind of close to each other, but you can add line spaces or line breaks in between these if you want to. It doesn't change the code and it makes it a little bit easier to read. So let's add some line breaks here. And let's make a div for our last question. So far we've asked the user for their name, we've asked for a location, and we've given them a choice between pizza and coffee. So let's ask after that, let's do a part of speech like we would see in a regular Mad Libs, and then we can see how that would work. So let's ask them for a verb. So we'll say ID equals verb dash div. And I'm going to go ahead and close that div down here. So anytime we open an HTML element, we also have to close that HTML element. Everything that goes in between these two div tags should be indented over, just like we see up here, so that it's nice and organized. So we're going to start with a paragraph to ask a question. So we'll say input a verb. And sometimes you can give them a context, so like a verb ending in ly or a verb ending in ing, depending on the grammar that you're going to use on the other side. You might want to give them something specific. So let's say input a verb, and then we have to create the input. So I just make an input tag like that, and I just need to give it an ID. And we'll say verb input. And then finally, as usual, we have a button. So we'll say, oops, button ID is verb button. And we'll say next here. And so now we can go over to the JavaScript, and we have to make sure to go through each one of the steps. And I'll try to talk about where each step sort of starts and ends, because it can be a little confusing. So the first thing that we want to do actually before we go to the JavaScript is we need to hide this verb div at the beginning, because since we just created this new one, if I reload this page, we'll see this in the beginning of our script. So we want to make sure to hide this so that it doesn't show up at the beginning with our first question. So I'll go back to style.css, and we can see down here I'm using one rule for all of these questions that I want to hide. So div ID place div ID choice div, and now I'll just add a comma here and say div ID verb div. And so now if I refresh this page, the verb div is gone. And so any rules that I want to apply to multiple elements in my HTML, I can use commas and just separate each one of those selectors, and then I can put whatever rules I want to apply to those divs in here. Okay, so now let's go to our script and let's go over each of the 3 steps that we have to do to get this to work correctly. So first step is to get references to the HTML. So we have 3 new components in our Mad Libs, and so we have to get a reference to each one. And so you can either copy and paste or write them from scratch. If you copy and paste, make sure to replace each variable and each HTML selector or ID. So if you have errors here, that's going to lead to things not working exactly the way you want. So if I'm going to copy and paste, I'll just select the entire choice div section and copy that. And then I'll paste the whole thing. And then I just have to replace each instance of choice with verb. It doesn't really matter what you use here. They just have to be consistent. So it just has to match what you have in the HTML with the same capitalization, same spelling, everything like that. And it has to match when we use it later on in our script. So for our verb div, we're going to use verb here. And I'll replace choice with verb here. I'll replace choice with verb here, and I'm just going to go through and do each one of these parts. And so we just have to make sure it's consistent and that we match the naming conventions that we used in our HTML. So then the next section is to add an event. So I put all of my references first, and then I add all of my events. You don't have to do it this way. It really doesn't actually matter that much what order you do things in, but it's nice to have everything sort of organized so it's easy to find the different components. You can very quickly find out if you're missing something or if you had a typo or something like that. So here we're going to add our verb button, and we're going to say dot add event listener. So this again is just going to listen for a user event. The type of event we're looking for is a click event, so when the user clicks the mouse on the button. And now we're going to add a function to run when that event occurs. And so this function doesn't exist yet, but we're going to write it. So when we click the verb button, we'll use get verb. And I'm using get here. This is not required. You can really name the functions anything you want, but we just want to name something that will be easy to find and easy to associate with this part of our program. So when we get the verb from the user, this is how we're going to react to that event. Okay, so let's review that, and then this part is going to be tricky. So this is a good thing to go over because we already have a function that deals with the ending of our program, but it's inside of our get choice. So there's a couple ways we could do that. We could make a separate function to handle the end of the program, or we could just rewrite the get choice function and then rewrite the get verb function. So to keep things nice and organized, why don't we add another function that specifically deals with the end of the program, and then we can call that function once we get our last input, which is our verb. So let's scroll down to the bottom because this is going to take a little bit of reading through our function to decide how to do this. So I'm actually going to collapse my other functions so I can just hit this little arrow to fold these functions so I can see everything a little bit clearer. So right now my last function is this get choice function. But this function actually does two things. First, it hides the choice div. That's the last question at this point in the program. But then it starts to create the story, which is really the kind of the end. So why don't we turn this ending part into its own function? So that's very easy to do. First, I'm just going to close my get choice function by putting a closed curly bracket after this choice, after we hide the choice div, and before we start creating the story. So basically I'm saying we want this function to end here, and we're just going to put everything else into a new function. So I'm going to start a new function here, and I'm going to call it create story. And you could call it a lot of things. You could call it like end program or something like that. We just want a name that kind of specifies what it actually does. And then let's move this comment down here because this is more appropriate for this function. So display a story with the user values. So now we need to take our get choice function and modify that to display the new question that we just added. And then we need to add a whole new function to get the new verb that we added in as well. So once we get the choice, we're going to hide our choice div, and then we'll display our verb div. So this is easy. I just say verb div.style.display, and we're going to set this to block. So we're going to say show verb question. And so block is just one of the default displays. You could use other display values here, but that's kind of the default for a div, so we'll just go with block. And one thing that you might notice is this is different from the other functions where we check to see if there's a value. Because the choice is a select where there's only two options, there's no way for the user to forget to put in a value there because there's not text input. So we don't really have to check to make sure there's a value there. There's no way for the user to kind of put in nothing. So we don't have to check for that there. So we skip that step. Okay, so our last step now is to get the verb. So we'll make a new function called getVerb. And here we are going to check to see if the user put in a verb because they do need to put something there. So we'll do something similar to our get name and get place. And then we also are coming to the end of the program, so we're gonna, once we get to the end, we're gonna call this create story function that's gonna do the end of the program for us. So the first thing we'll do is check to see if there's an input. So we'll say if, and I'll put a comment here, check for verb input. So we have if verb input dot value. So this is just checking to make sure that there's some value that the user put in here. So if they put in a value here, we're going to hide this div. So we'll say verb div dot style dot display equals none. So just like each of our previous examples, we're just hiding this section of the HTML. And then we're going to go to the end. So we'll say create story. So we've got all of our inputs. So we'll just go to our last function. We'll create the story and display it to the user. If they don't have a value here, then we'll use our else block. So if there's no value there, then we'll tell them that they have to add a value there. So I'm going to go back to my getPlace function and just see how I did that before. So I added a border color, a little red border color, and then I changed a placeholder to say that a value is required. So let's just copy and paste and then update this for our verb input. So I'll copy those two lines and I'll scroll back down to get verb and Command V, paste those in there. But again, I have to make sure to, anytime I copy and paste, I have to make sure to update to use the correct variable. So this is verb input and verb input here. And we also need to change the text that displays because we're not talking about the place anymore, we're talking about the verb. So then the last thing we need to do is actually include the verb in our story. So let's review our story function and then we're almost done. So in our story function, we start creating the story by creating a new variable. And this variable is going to contain each part of our story. So we start off by saying hi, and then we use the user name, and we have a little exclamation mark for punctuation. And then we have our story, so we say let's go to, and then we have our place input there, and then we have a period for our punctuation. And notice a couple of things here. Once I create the story variable, I don't have to use VAR again later. This is all I have to do to create the story variable. Once it exists, I can reuse it or I can change it or add to it as many times as I want. So in these subsequent lines, I just use story by itself. So then we check for different inputs for our choice for coffee or pizza. And of course, you can add as many choices as you want in a select like that. And depending on the input, we add more to the story. And then let's add our last verb to the story. So we can say story plus equals. And here, let's use our username again. Since we can reuse these inputs, we don't have to use them just once. So we'll say name input dot value. And then we have a verb, so we're going to use that. So we're going to say name input value. And then we have to add a space here. So remember, with our values, it's not going to format our sentences for us. So if we want spaces and punctuation, we have to add them in explicitly. So let's add a space. And then we'll say, so name input value and verb input dot value. So we can say, the name does the verb, and then we can add something at the end. So let's say, so name verb, and then after having, and then we can go back to our choice again if we want to here. So we would have to repeat this whole if block. Or we could actually just use, well, it's going to be capitalized, so it would look kind of weird. So let's repeat our if block here, but now we're just saying coffee or pizza. So we'll say coffee here or pizza here. Actually, we could use a .2 lowercase, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So then once we finish this whole story, let's add a little punctuation here. And then we have our response.textContent equals story. So this displays the story to the user. So I think that should be everything. We'll probably need to do a little editing to make the grammar make sense, but I'm just using this as an example, so we don't really care if it's perfect quite yet. So let's see if that all works. So I'm going to refresh my example. I'm going to input my name, and I'll input a place, and I'll choose coffee, and I'll input a verb. I'll say run. And so we get our final story. Hi, Owen, let's go to New York. Let's get a coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. Owen, run after having coffee. So that doesn't make sense grammatically, so that's where you might want to prompt the user to use a verb ending in S or ing or ly, depending on what that point of the story is telling. But you can kind of modify that to match the story that you want to use. So that's how we would update to add a little bit more content and make sure we have everything in there. If you get any errors or anything like that, remember to have your console open so you'll see those errors before you try to figure out what they are. And of course, if you have questions, we can go over how to address those. All right, so let's stop there. We can do some workshop time. You guys can continue working on the content. In the second part of class, I'll just quickly go over submitting this project, which is pretty straightforward. It's very similar to the last project we did, so it's basically the same steps. So we'll submit this on OpenLab and Blackboard, and then we'll have, again, more class time to work on this project or other projects that you might be working on.